Hello, welcome to the Brazilian Report's Insider Talks. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Brazilian Report. And this time, we will discuss how the looming threats of tariffs from the Donald Trump administration may affect Brazil and reshape relations between the United States and Brazil, not just in the short term, but also in the long run. And for this discussion, I am honored to have a very interesting panel of speakers from Washington, D.C. We have Tony Harrington. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Brasilia, founding principal of the Albright Stonebridge International Advisory Firm, and he was also chair of the President's Intelligence Oversight Board and currently serves as chair of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. Hello, Tony. Thanks for joining us.
Bom dia.
Bom dia. Also from Washington, we have Kelly Myman-Huck. She's a senior counselor at McLarty Associates, a global strategic advisory firm, and a board member of the Inter-American Dialogue. Kelly is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer and served in Porto Alegre, São Paulo, and Recife in Brazil, as well as at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the Executive Office of the President as Director for Brazil and the Southern Cone. Thanks for joining us, Kelly. Welcome.
Thanks, Gustavo.
And from Beijing, Welber Bahao, a founding partner of BMJ. He's an expert in international trade and investment with over 30 years of experience, served as Brazil's Secretary of Foreign Trade between 2007 and 2011. So that spans the Lula and Dilma administrations, and has acted as an arbitrator in Mercosur and World Trade Organization disputes. He currently advises FIESP, the Federation of Industries in the state of São Paulo, and presides over IBCI, the Brazilian Institute of Foreign Trade. Welber, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This event, as I said, is brought to you by the Brazilian Report. We are a premier English language news service providing essential on-the-ground coverage of Brazil and Latin America's political landscape, economic developments, and social trends. And the quality of our work has been recognized through multiple international awards, and I would like to highlight just a few. We won Best Newsletter and Best News Website in the Americas in 2023 and 2024 by the World Association of News Publishers, and we are finalists for Best Newsletter this year. The results are coming in on April the 3rd, so fingers crossed. And if you're still not a member, a premium subscriber to the Brazilian Report, we invite you to go to brazilian.report/subscribe. Our business model is axed around subscriptions, which allows us to remain 100% independent. Everything we write has only one goal: pure journalism. Also, stay tuned until the end to qualify for gifts and a few perks, and I'm sure that won't be difficult given the quality of our panelists. So just before we kick off the discussion, a quick reminder: you can send us questions on YouTube or on our website, and our producers will select the best ones for me to direct to our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to start with a broad question for our former ambassador, Tony Harrington. We have seen since Trump took office him talking about tariffs, announcing a few new tariff policies, walking back on some of them. Yesterday, he announced 25% tariffs on imported cars, and he still promises a significant tariff announcement for April the 2nd. So, Tony, what are you hearing in Washington in terms of what he's actually going to do, maybe how Brazil could be affected by it, and Trump's rationale on all of this? Because a lot of economists have slammed his tariff policies.
Yes. Well, two words, I think, describe the situation to me. One is unpredictable. He's generally unpredictable, period. and the second one is aggressive. He is being and likely to continue to be aggressive. He said at one point, tariffs is a beautiful word, and if they charge us, we'll charge them. We do have a large trade deficit, so that is the fundamental rationale for attention to the trade relationships and tariffs. The landscape is broad, as you know. There's been more specific tariff attention to China, Canada, and Mexico, and ongoing with the European Union. But as you suggested, Gustavo, there is quite a bit of angst and resistance to this extensive tariff initiative. President Trump likes to look at the stock market, but he expects it to reflect positively on him and his administration. It's not. It's been going down. It's ironic that when I look at our family investments online, I halfway celebrate the fact that they've declined in value a bit. Fortunately, not as much as the average. And business leaders are speaking out with some degree of hesitation because of the potential retribution. Notice I follow Politico here in the U.S. And in the last few daily issues, it's been sponsored by the National Retail Federation, or whatever it's called, and it's warning against the potential detriment of the tariffs to smaller businesses and more generally. We'll talk more about the diplomatic situation in due course, but it's good that Vice President and Minister Alckmin has reached out to Secretary of Commerce, and as the Brazilian report indicates today, Gustavo, communication has now gone to the U.S. Trade Representative, which is one that I've been thinking that loop needs to be joined in any event.
And Tony, if I may jump in, because you touched on Brazil, and I'd like to bring Welber into the discussion, because the U.S. is Brazil's third largest trading partner, or second if you don't count the EU as a single entity. But it is a very different trade relationship between Brazil and the U.S. and Brazil and China. For China, we export roughly commodities and basic goods, but the U.S. is the prime destination for our industrialized goods or manufactured goods. If sweeping tariffs are imposed on Brazil, and Trump said that each country will get a number depending on their trade relationship with the U.S., what specific sectors of the Brazilian economy do you anticipate will be the most vulnerable to this set of new trade measures? We have already seen tariffs on steel goods. The U.S. has already talked about ethanol, but what are you anticipating?
Yeah. So, Gustavo, as of today, because of course every day we have news and every day we have some threats, some of them do not materialize. But as of today, the steel and aluminum sector, the U.S. is an important market, and they were affected in 2017. There was some negotiation about quotas. The Brazilian exports stagnated, but there was still some exports to the U.S. Now, at a higher rate, of course, it will be more difficult for steel and aluminum to be present at the U.S. market. Besides that, we have already 232 investigations against lumber and against copper. And these are all the two products that, if they are hit, they are important exports from Brazil. Besides that, we have a lot of indirect effects. For example, I know a company that exports a lot of auto parts to Mexico, and then they export final vehicles to the U.S. Of course, they are being affected. The contracts have been suspended. So it will be a broad effect overall. And we have to calculate that Brazil, one of the Brazilian alternatives is to look for new markets and try to export, especially to Latin America, which is, let's say, the most reachable market for Brazilian manufactured goods.
And Kelly, to bring you into the discussion, Tony also mentioned the diplomatic side of things. And I would like, if you can, to characterize the current state of U.S.-Brazil relations under the Lula-Trump dynamic. I mean, Lula just a couple of days before the U.S. election explicitly endorsed Kamala Harris. Do you think, and he has taken some digs at Trump, sometimes indirectly, sometimes more directly. Do you think there is room for constructive engagement despite these quite deep ideological differences?
Yeah, I mean, these are two gentlemen that don't see the world in the same way, right? There are distinct ideological perspectives coming from each individual and each administration. So I personally, when it comes to commercial issues that we've been discussing, I've been relieved to see that Vice President Alckmin has been deputized, if you will, to interface with the U.S. government. I think that was an outstanding choice. I also have been pleased to see, and Velber, I assume you're working on some aspects of this, the Brazilian private sector engaging on these issues, because I think it's important to highlight that the Brazil-U.S. economic relationship, just talking about that for a moment, it's not just bilateral, right? I mean, there are a number of Brazilian companies that have significant investments in the United States, that have made significant investments in North America to take advantage of USMCA, the new NAFTA, which is obviously under fire right now. And so having a number of voices, not just the presidency, but having the private sector, having other individuals in the government advocating on these issues, I think will be very important. I've been personally, somewhat relieved that Brazil hasn't been, at least the first country in the crosshairs, because if you look at some of the motivators of Trump trade policy and Trump tariffs, on some measures, for example, trade deficits, Brazil's in pretty good shape because we've been, more or less equal, up, down, but, fairly consistently equal over the years. But then on other issues, for example, reciprocity, where the announcement on that is expected next week, you see Brazil much more vulnerable given the tariff peaks that Brazil has on some products. So definitely a challenging picture, Gustavo, but always room for dialogue.
No, and you mentioned Alckmin. So Alckmin, he has talked about the importance of diplomacy, of a win-win approach to the trade relationship, and he has advocated against retaliation, saying that when you take an eye for an eye, everybody ends up blind. But when you listen to essentially the head of the Brazilian government, President Lula, he has taken a different approach. Just yesterday, he says that Brazil will go to the WTO, and if that doesn't work, we'll retaliate. We'll do a very tit-for-tat approach from now on. Now, it's important to say that on many occasions when Lula is speaking, he's speaking also to a domestic audience. He wants also to put that image of, okay, we will not be made a fool of ourselves on the international stage. And I would also assume that Brazil is not necessarily a country to where Trump is looking. Am I missing something here? Do you think that this approach can have deleterious effects on the Brazil-U.S. trade relationship if it reaches the Trump's ear that Lula has been sometimes ramping up his tone when talking about U.S. tariffs?
For me?
Yes, please.
No, perfect. Yeah, I mean, here's what I would say. Countries have taken different perspectives and different approaches in trying to have policy responses to the tariffs applied and threatened by President Trump. So you've seen Canada and China go forward very swiftly with retaliation. You've seen counter threats from President Trump in that regard. So from my perspective, given Brazil's unique position with respect to its trade and investment relationship with the United States, I actually think it makes sense for Brazil to keep its powder dry, to let some of this dust settle, to see how this announcement on reciprocity comes out next week. And just obviously, as Brazil already has with respect to steel and aluminum, stay engaged, and presumably will do the same on automobiles, given yesterday's announcement. But I think rushing to retaliation when we are in such a dynamic trade moment in the United States, where the impact of some of the policies that have been announced are very clearly going to have a negative impact on some of our productive sectors here in the United States, just given the intertwined nature of our supply chains and the speed with which a number of these policies are being applied. So I think letting that settle a bit before Brazil takes decisive action is quite wise.
And Tony, you were a former U.S. ambassador to Brasilia. This position is currently vacant. We have the chargé d'affaires as the top diplomat in Brazil right now. How much do you think this handicaps the dialogue between the two administrations and negotiations around something that could spare Brazil from a major tariffs? And also, I'd like to bring in a question from our audience from Sebastian, from Raquel, I'm sorry, talking about if there is a possibility of any tax treaty between Brazil and the U.S. What do you think, Tony?
Well, it would be desirable for us to have a respected and influential ambassador in Brazil soon. I think Brazil has a very good ambassador here, and Ambassador Viotti. And I think Kelly was suggesting to some extent it's time for a little patience on Brazil's part rather than to rush into some retaliatory approach. As I said earlier, I think Alckmin is a good choice as an interlocutor, and it needed to be extended to the USTR dialogue, which it has been, as just reported. I would like to see Secretary Rubio in the picture as well. He's unusually a Latino as Secretary of State. His first trip outside the U.S. was to the region, Latin America, but it was to more the Caribbean countries and not to the major countries, larger countries in South America. Kelly referred to some favorable facts in terms of the relationship that for Brazil, U.S. is the second largest export market after China. And for the U.S., it's the sixth largest trade surplus that we have with a country. So very important to get those facts to register with U.S. Policymakers and, frankly, probably also publicly to some extent. Brazil needs to keep its powder dry for a little bit, but probably should be considering where it would reciprocate if it becomes important and prudent to do so. As I've mentioned in other context, I was privileged to be ambassador in Brazil when the Cardozos, President and Mrs. Cardo and President and Mrs. Clinton, were each other's closest first family relationships. So it was a warm time in U.S.-Brazil right at the highest level. That's not going to happen with Trump and Lula. So another reason why Alckmin is a good...
No, and you mentioned the first family, and let's just remember that First Lady Rosângela Janja da Silva, just prior to the G20 meeting, said, "F you, Elon Musk," someone who has been very close to President Trump. So to your point, yes, we should not expect that level of warmness between the first families.
Well, yeah, and on the other hand, you've got the Bolsonaro factor big in the news with the Supreme Court moving forward, and you had the Supreme Court also shutting down Musk, Twitter was it then, or X, due to content issues. So I let's hope that Musk does not get involved in this discussion.
Right. Now I want to bring Welber and Kelly to answer a question from Ricardo from our audience, because I think it touches on a point that we were talking just before going live. And Ricardo says, as the U.S. pursues more protectionist policies, what lessons can be learned from Brazil's protectionist policies and their effects, which have, yes, increased multinationals' footprint here in manufacturing in Brazil, but have also increased the cost of items like phones, clothing, cars. And just a quick reminder, I remember we did a story, I think 12 years ago. I was working in a weekly magazine, and it was cheaper to fly to Miami, stay overnight, and buy an iPhone there than to buy an iPhone in Brazil. So, Welber, do you want to go first and then Kelly?
Yes, sure. Well, I'd like to make a comment also on Kelly's point that I think Mexico's position was very smart at this point. They were very cautious. They tried to negotiate before imposing any kind of retaliation. And probably that will be the Brazilian position. Although there are two remarks we have to point out. One is that it's very difficult to define reciprocity in international trade. Reciprocity, since the Bretton Woods meeting, have been the negotiation of trade rounds, tariff rounds in GATT, and then at the WTO. And that was the result of reducing tariffs for everybody, but with some level of protection for certain sectors. You see that clearly in the ethanol case. President Trump has mentioned ethanol, the Brazilian ethanol tariff of 18% in some occasions. But the very fact is that if you take the U.S. tariff for Brazilian sugar, the same sector, you are talking about 90%. If you convert the extra quota per ton tariff that is imposed. So it's not so easy to talk about reciprocity when you have this kind of tariff peaks also in the US. But then, and the other thing is there are some very particular issues. Talking about ethanol, for example, Brazilian ethanol comes from sugarcane. It has less emissions than the US ethanol. It's more competitive from the point of view of environmental standards. So for every sector, international trade is much more complicated. That has been explained by the Trump administration to the general population in the US. And then, as you said, we can take the Brazilian experience. All the ideology of import substitution was important in the 60s and 70s to industrialize Brazil, to industrialize Mexico, Argentina. These large countries use their domestic market to attract investment and to bring industries to their territory. After a while, this production becomes less competitive. You have a system of capturing advantages in favor of some sectors. You have higher prices than international prices. You have less competitiveness for the local consumer. And that's something that the US consumer is going to see very soon.
And Kelly, before you jump in, I would like to ask you to add another thing for you to comment on, which is, and to Ricardo's point, our audience member who sent this question, Brazil has enormous tariffs. We have a very insular economy here. So do you think also this undermines Brazil's case in trying to dodge these Trump tariffs, because maybe they could look like a holier than thou thing, like, we can tariff everyone, but please don't tariff us.
Yeah, no, Gustavo, I love your question, making the comparison, because it's something that I've been doing a lot going back to the Biden administration, when the United States really pivoted from having trade policy as our leading calling card for economic growth and development. And we pivoted to industrial policy with, fairly ambitious local content requirements. And frankly, looking a lot like a lot of the policies that I had worked on as a diplomat and as a consultant in Brazil over the course of my career. The issue is, if you're going to engage in industrial policy, you need to be sure that you are providing the environment for those industries to grow and the inputs. And so I think the challenge is when you're trying to grow homegrown local investments in industrial services, technology, whatever the case might be, it's very important to approach your trade policy from a surgical perspective. So, if you are going to engage in protection, that it be very strategic on the items that you are trying to actually generate production in, but being very careful to let in those products that are allowing you to be productive, your inputs, et cetera. So in that regard, that is what I think is the big challenge right now about the more blanket approach that the Trump administration is taking. And I do think, as I was talking before about some of the dust needing to settle, I think some of that dust is going to settle, with respect to that space, with respect to what inputs do we need? Some of them will be from Brazil, I'm sure, particularly in the aerospace sector. What do we need from our trading partners across the board to ensure that the U.S. production, which the Trump administration is stating as its primary objective, so that can actually grow? So I think that's going to have to work itself out, Gustavo.
Yeah, Gustavo, if I may, I'd like to add.
Of course, you may.
That you mentioned, in fact. Yes, Brazil has very high average tariffs. We are talking about 11, 12% as Mercosur common tariff. But most of the highest tariffs in Brazil are related to consumer goods. And we import a lot of raw material, parts, equipment from the US. So if you look at the applicable tariffs into US imports, you are talking about 2%. In average.
And to be specific, according to a document the Brazilian government sent the U.S. Trade Representative's office, 2.73% is the weighted average tariff collected on U.S. goods, which they say significantly lower than the average nominal tariff of 11%.
Yeah. And the pushback that the U.S. government has on that is, well, if those other tariffs were lower, we'd be able to export you more in those other tariff lines as well. So this has been an ongoing debate going back to when I was at USTR, right? That, you know, is if we got the levels lower, you know, would that benefit U.S. exports? And the U.S. government has always argued that it would.
And Kelly, if I think we have a segue here to this next point that I plan to ask you, which is the Brazilian government plans to take these matters to the WTO. But I mean, the WTO has been weakened in recent years, and given Trump's skepticism towards multilateral institutions, I mean, are there international fora or mechanisms that might still be effective to Brazil to address trade disputes with the U.S.? Because in its 2025 trade agenda, the U.S. government committed to, and I quote, reclaiming American sovereignty from unaccountable foreign bureaucrats. So how should we deal with the U.S.?
Yeah, the Trump administration is not a huge fan of the WTO, spoiler alert. But let's be clear, and the WTO has been weakening over many, many administrations, going back to the Obama administration, which is where the United States started stepping back from support for the appellate body. So I think that, you know, Brazil as a very important player in the multilateral trading system, and specifically in the WTO, has had to adjust to that reality. I do think that it's very important to continue to file cases at the WTO, because eventually we are at a crisis moment right now when it comes to how we're organizing the global trading system. It's a huge inflection point, not just here in the United States, but globally. I think it's important that we not further invalidate the World Trade Organization by not filing cases. That said, we all know that's not going to be the path to resolution, at least not right now. So I think having a very strategic approach to bilateral engagement, perhaps bilateral engagement with friends and allies where Brazil has interests that are aligned with other countries in their approach to the United States. I think that is going to be really the best path for Brazilian diplomats, companies, and officials going forward.
And Tony, Kelly mentions allies and friends, and Lula is on an Asian trip. He tried to open the Japanese market to Brazilian beef. He's now currently in Vietnam. Brazil has tried to look more fondly of Asia, not just China, but Asia more broadly for trade. Starting the Bolsonaro administration already rehearsed trying to get closer to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. How do you see other options if the door to trade with the U.S. is, I would not say slam shut, but at least narrowed a little bit, or if the path to exporting to the U.S. is rockier? Welber mentioned Latin America, more specifically South America, but do you see also that we could pivot to Asia, and to which countries we could be competitive, especially when we talk about industrialized goods, because, I mean, they have China just next door?
Yes, I think focusing on Southeast Asia is a good possibility. Also focusing on certain countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, have a lot of potential and playing more of a role on the world stage. So I think that would be wise to have on the Brazilian agenda. You mentioned the BRICS, where I guess Lula is currently chair. I don't think the BRICS is a great forum for addressing these issues.
Why not?
Well, was from the beginning sort of not a comprehensive group. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now it's expanded, but I don't believe the U.S. Is involved there. I think the G7 and the G20 ministerials are better fora for addressing these concerns.
Right, and well, to Tony's point, we have a question from Luis Fernando, and he's asking. Tony doesn't think that BRICS might be the appropriate forum for this, but Luis Fernando asks if Brazil might make use or should make use of its role as part of the BRICS, or chair of the BRICS this year, and the geopolitics of Russia and China being also part of the BRICS, in order to avoid being bullied around by Trump. Do you think this would be a savvy move, or that it would add other layers of risk to Brazil?
Well, if you look at the Brazilian agenda, not only for the BRICS, but also for the COP this year in Brazil, or the G7 meeting last year, Brazil is focusing a lot on the environmental agenda, the green agenda in general, renewable energies, that Brazil has a lot of potential, and the reform of multilateral institutions, especially the financial multilateral institutions. And this agenda, of course, is not going to be supported by the Trump administration. On the other hand, if you look at the outcome, or what BRICS has achieved so far, what is concrete among the BRICS countries is the NDB, the New Development Bank. Many other initiatives, they are not coordinated because, as Tony has mentioned, we are talking about very different countries with different geopolitical interests. So it's not easy to coordinate BRICS. But having said that, we have to take into account that China today is more than 30% of the Brazilian exports. Russia is a big provider of fertilizers, which are essential for the Brazilian agriculture. India is a market that is spending a lot for Brazilian exports too. And so you have a lot of opportunities with these countries. Brazil is investing a lot in trade promotion, invest promotion with these countries. Some the new entrants, like the Emirates, for example, are investing heavily in Brazil. They want to achieve a free trade agreement with Mercosur. They are insisting on that agreement in a very short term. So there are some movements going on individually between Brazil and the BRICS countries, but I agree with Tony, it's very difficult to have a general coordination.
Well, one thing, if I could just add, oh, go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I think it's fine for Brazil to be in the BRICS and the leadership role and so forth. I mainly was suggesting it's not a good forum to address trade and tariff, especially in regard to the U.S. posture.
Yeah, well, one benefit, Gustavo, that I think Brazil has is that Brazil has always been so non-aligned and flexible in the way that it approaches both foreign policy and trade policy. In other words, we'll talk to anybody that wants to trade with us. We're not going to lash ourselves to just one alliance. And there were times that frustrated the United States. Certainly as we tried to get Brazil to jump into the free trade area, the Americas pool with us and other initiatives. But at this point in time, the approach looks pretty smart, to be honest. And I think that Brazil, obviously needs to be careful to not become overexposed to China, as well sits there in China. But just because, to have as many trading options as possible in this current geopolitical environment, particularly when China is as sensitive as it is, not just in the United States, but in Europe and other areas of the world. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet that I think is just important to flag is the EU-Mercosur agreement perhaps being a positive deliverable, if you will, of the current trade chaos that's going on. I've always kind of joked about it when I present on Brazil, saying, oh, they might get that through when my grandkids are doing trade policy. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that this moment has both Brazil and Europe, including French farmers who are afraid of competing with Brazil's agricultural exports, thinking, you know what, we all need more options right now. We all need to be sure that we've got as many good, solid trading partners as possible. So that's one agreement that I'm watching, at least, to see if the current dynamic with the United States trade relationship might nudge that agreement forward.
Yes, no, I was going to ask you about this deal right now because, and then I think I can bring Welber, because he wrote recently about Brazil's retaliatory instruments, and my question is, do these instruments present a threat for the deal? Because Brazil, so long story short, Brazil has a bill in Congress right now that was initially aimed at allowing Brazil to retaliate against what Brazilian farmer lobbies say that it's environmental protectionism. They say that France and other agricultural nations in Europe are under the guise of protecting the environment, just doing traditional protectionism when blocking the EU-Mercosur deal. And now these instruments have been expanded in Congress to any retaliatory measure against any moves against Brazilian trade. But more specifically about the EU deforestation law, which is going to come into effect and which targets very key Brazilian exports to Europe. Welber, do you think that the fact that, particularly in France, politicians are starting to see the U.S. as an adversary, and then that they have to have new alliances in terms of defense, but also trade? Do you think that we can untie that knot?
Yeah. So, first about the European Union and Mercosur, it's a long negotiation. And all the time we are counting the votes in the European Council to see if we have the votes to approve the agreement. And there is the opposition of France, Poland, Ireland, which we have more lobbying from the farmers in these countries. But you are right. I think there will be some movements because of the Trump's policies. Not only Europe. I think Europe is something that we should approve. We can have a scenario of course, it has to go through the European Parliament, through the national congresses in Mercosur. Is going to take some years. But if you have a positive movement, that's very good to increase trade and investment. On the other hand, as I said, you have other countries. For example, Canada has a long negotiation with Mercosur. This negotiation was basically stopped since 3 years ago, and now Canada is interested again on the agreement with Mercosur. So you see some movements because of the threat that the market access to the U.S. will be more difficult. Regarding the bill, you are right. The bill was proposed initially looking at the European measures, especially the CBAN and the deforestation law that could affect Brazilian exports. So its initial step was to create some retaliation mechanism against the European environmental laws. But the last report from Senator Teresa Cristina is looking at the U.S. And basically she's updating the regulation that we already have from the cotton case. In 2009, Brazil approved a law allowing the federal CAMEX, basically, but the federal government to retaliate countries that adopted discriminatory measures against Brazil, not only on goods, but also on services and intellectual property. And that was really the factor that made the U.S. negotiate seriously on the cotton case. So there is the cotton case was a very important case in Brazilian memory and the institutional networking in terms of reacting against the other country's position. And to tell you the truth, I think that what the Trump administration is not considering is that at some point, countries are going to adopt very painful measures against the U.S. economy, not only on target retaliation, because there's an art of retaliation. The art of retaliation is causing pain without affecting your own industry.
And by the way, you mentioned the need of being very strategic in that. Which sectors in the U.S. do you think are more vulnerable if it comes to it, and Brazil says, okay, we're stepping into the ring? Which sectors would be the best ones for the Brazilian government to target without wreaking havoc here in Brazil?
Yeah. So in the case of Brazil, the experience, as I said, in the cotton case, is that threatening patents, especially patents in the pharmaceutical sector, was very effective in terms of not to use it. It's like having the atomic bomb. You don't want to use it, but it's a credible threat that makes the U.S. government move because of all the lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. But you have other two sectors that are probably.
I think we have an issue with Welber's connection, but Kelly,
I can jump in if you want. I mean, I don't know what he was going to say, but I would comment that in addition to intellectual property, one of the areas that other countries are looking at as they're thinking about retaliation options other than tariffs is government procurement, and looking at how they're procuring U.S. goods and services. Another area that folks are looking at is services and digital. Those are obviously incredibly competitive areas of our economy. And another area is export taxes, believe it or not, and looking at just trying to increase the cost for U.S. companies and U.S. consumers of goods that are exported to the United States. So none of these are great solutions. None of these are great for, Brazil's companies or consumers, or United States companies and consumers. But in this moment, to Welber's case or point rather of you want to, kind of have these items to deploy, but ideally not deploy them. Those are some of the options that I'm hearing countries talking about.
And Kelly, I would like to mush in together two questions from our audience, one from Bernard and one from, I think it's Jürgen. So according to the Brazilian Trade and Industry Ministry, there are 3,600 American companies in Brazil. How would a tariff, investing in Brazil at least, how would a tariff war between Brazil, a trade war between Brazil and the U.S. impact investments from American companies in the U.S. In Brazil? I'm sorry. And also, some people say that part of the rationale that the Trump administration has is correcting an overvaluation of the dollar. So what possible impacts on the Brazilian, how could this new trade scenario that, of course, we still don't know what that scenario will be, but if you can look at your crystal ball and tell me what do you think these effects could be?
Yeah, as far as U.S. companies that are invested in Brazil, the motivation for investing in Brazil for U.S. companies is not the same as the motivation for U.S. companies investing in Mexico, for example, where our supply chains are so deeply integrated and have been for such a long time. So I'm not saying that our supply chains aren't integrated at all. Certainly in a number of areas, I already highlighted, aerospace, but there's agriculture and steel and aluminum. I mean, our own steel and aluminum industry, it interacts quite a bit with the Brazilian one, which is part of why Brazil was able to achieve quotas the last time around. There are areas where there will be an impact, but a great number of U.S. investors in Brazil, it's Brazil for Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a market that has a high tariff burden and a high tax burden, so it's not. That companies are investing there necessarily to use it as an export platform, as is the case in other markets. So compared to other countries, maybe less of an impact. But it's funny. I mean, we're talking about trade here, and to be clear, I'm a trade, not a finance guy. But when you talk to investors and certainly from the financial sector in Brazil, there's a lot more concern about what the Fed is going to do with interest rates and how we're going to, manage our budget process than any of the things we're talking about here. I certainly am not the expert in that area, but we're going to continue to see dynamism in that area of policy in the United States as well as trade policy.
Right. I think we're moving into our home stretch. So I'd like to ask for each one of you to weigh into this question. And I think we could start with Welber because while we have you, your connection had a small problem. But looking beyond the immediate trade tensions, what long-term structural changes might we see in the Brazil-U.S. economic relations as a result of this new protectionist era? Welber, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's funny that I just mentioned the Chinese government and then I fell. No? So, anyway, if you look, yes, we are going to see a structural change in the bilateral relationship. It has been a very stable relationship in the last 20 years. We have few disputes with the U.S. The U.S. has a surplus in trade with Brazil. We have seen Brazilian investment growing in the U.S. So it's a pity that we have these challenges now. Having said that, what you probably see is that the U.S. participation in Brazilian trade is going to diminish even more. It was 25% 20 years ago. Now it's less than 12%, and more Brazil is looking to Asia, mostly because of commodities, as you mentioned, and not only that. One interesting thing is that the Chinese or the Asian retaliation against the Trump one administration's measures increased Brazilian exports and gave more space for Brazilian exports to Asian countries. So that may happen again. The other alternative is that because we don't have this many issues regarding geopolitical issues with the United States, that we can keep the relationship at least stable for the next 3 years and hope for better times.
Tony, you wanna come in?
Yes, I think to some extent we have to take a long and medium term look here and not just short term and immediate. The future relations depend on the consequences of steps that are taken now. And as I mentioned, I think a good many U.S. business leaders and associations are concerned about the unfolding consequences of tariffs and protectionist approach. So taking a long-term view, it depends on politics and elections in various places around the world that still have elections. And hopefully in 2026 and then 2028, there will be enhancement of Democratic positions in the House or Senate, the Congress. And I think the governors in the U.S. are prepared to play more of an active role than they have, and we need them to. Let's, and as far as Brazilian companies, I think maybe keep your powder dry for a while, but also have a look at the possibility of increasing manufacturing in the U.S.
Kelly, how do you see the long-term changes for our bilateral relations from now on?
Yeah, I mean, things are clearly going to change, right? I mean, I think to my earlier points, Brazil has had diversified enough relationships internationally that this is not the earthquake that it is, in a Canada or a Mexico, but it's a shift. I would say, and just keying off of something that Tony said with respect to the growing importance of governors. I mean, one of the dynamics that we've seen here in the United States as this trade policy has unfolded, and as Congress has been, to be diplomatic, a bit shy in exerting its control over trade policy in the face of some pretty bold moves by the Trump administration. We've seen state and local officials in the United States really, step up. I mean, they're the ones on the front lines, working with their constituents, working with the investors in their states. And I know that, historically, and a couple of us have mentioned the fact that there has been growth in Brazilian investment in the United States, in over the years. Historically, Brazilian companies investing in the United States have kept a pretty low profile, and I get that. But in this environment, I guess I would just, put a word out that, taking a look at what Japanese investors, Korean investors, European investors have done in the United States, vis-a-vis their positioning with, in many cases, federal officials. The federal level is a bit complicated right now, but with state and local officials as well. I think having those constituents and stakeholders in the U.S. to help to weather this moment is something that's incredibly important.
Well, I'd like to thank you all, Tony Harrington, Kelly Maiman-Hawk, and Welber Bahal, for your time and for your valuable insights. It was a pleasure, very enriching conversation for me, and I hope we can talk soon over a cup of coffee in Washington or in Brasilia when Welber is back from Beijing. Thank you very much. And for our audience, I'd just like to say that at the Brazilian Reporter, subscribers don't just read the news, they tap into our expertise for tailor-made insights. And today, you get a rare chance to experience that firsthand. We're giving away a 30-minute private consulting session with our editorial team, but just for the first 3 people who download our recap of this conversation tomorrow. Last time, dozens of people downloaded it within the first few hours, but only 5 scored the session. And this time, only 3 spots will be available. And so the first 3 people will win this 30-minute consulting session. The next 3, a 3-month premium membership of the Brazilian Report, and the next 4, 1-month premium membership. Kelly, Welber, and Tony, thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for the good work that the Brazilian report does.
Yeah. Good to see you guys.
Have a good one. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much, and have a good end of the week, everyone.